I'm doing my parable over the laborers in the vineyard, like Mikey did. I want to give a little bit of background before we get started with my actual parable. I'm going to kind of cover a couple of the things that he did, which he done a really good job of covering it. I used a couple different verses than he did. The main focus of the lesson is going to be out of Matthew chapter 20. That's where my parable can be found. The background is going to be in Matthew chapter 13. Okay, so if you all want to, you can mark in Matthew chapter 20 and then turn to Matthew chapter 13 real quick. So what Mikey talked about, and then what I'm going to mention also is we kind of asked the question, why doesn't Jesus just tell the people like it is? Why doesn't he just come forward and tell them straight up and give them the lesson or give them whatever it is he's trying to tell them like he wants to, or like we think maybe he should. And he tells them here that there's reasons for this. There's reasons for the parables, and these reasons are kind of what he's going to cover right here in Matthew chapter 13, verses 10 and 11. He says, "Then the disciples came and said to him, 'Why do you speak to them in parables?' And he answered them, 'To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given.'" And then he goes on, skip a verse, and then go to verse 13 in the same chapter. He says, "This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." So, and it kind of foreshadows a little bit what we're going to talk about, or what I've got written down about the disciples and kind of teaching them a lesson also. But Jesus tells the disciples that you all have a little bit better understanding and a little bit better knowledge than the common people do, and so sometimes when you're trying to talk to people that don't really have a good understanding of a particular subject. For example, if you're trying to talk to me about how to change an engine out of a car, it's not going to go very well. You're going to need to put it in some kind of terminology other than how to take an engine out of a car. So that's what he does in this certain situation. Is he tries to put it in some type of story or some type of, I guess if you want to call it a metaphor or a simile. My English teacher's sitting in here and she's going to say, "You don't know the difference between those two?" Sorry, I forgot. But it's going to kind of put it in a comparison that we can relate to something else, and that lesson is going to come to fruition later on at the end of the parable. Okay, so also what we're going to cover first before we actually get to the parable is with many of the parables in the Bible. If you go back a little bit, you can kind of get a little bit of understanding as to why Jesus is talking about this parable, why he's putting this parable into practice. And this parable is no different. My parable of laborers in the vineyard is no different, because you have a certain scenario that takes place in Matthew chapter 19 that kind of sets the stage for why he's going to talk about needing laborers in the vineyard. To give a little bit of background here, and I don't have all of the scriptures word for it. I've tried to summarize it a little bit for time's sake. In Matthew chapter 19, you have a rich man that comes up to Jesus, okay, and it makes it known very, very clearly that this man is a very wealthy man, and he asks Jesus, "What can I do to achieve eternal life?" Okay, and he's probably looking for a particular answer here. However, sometimes the answer we're looking for isn't the answer that we get. So Jesus tells the wealthy man, "You need to go and give everything you own. Give all these prized possessions that you own. Go give them away. Give them to the poor, and then leave everything and come follow me." And so naturally, this person who has amassed all these great earthly treasures is sad. He's upset that that's the answer that Jesus gave him, and that's not what he really wanted to hear. So he goes away sad, and doesn't. We kind of assume there that he doesn't give away all of his stuff and follow Jesus. So, and this gives Jesus an opportunity to teach the disciples a lesson first. And so, this is one of the a more well-known scripture that you hear a lot of times, where Jesus looks at the disciples and he says, after a little bit of discussion, he says, again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Now, he doesn't say it's impossible. He doesn't say it's impossible for wealthy people to enter into heaven. He just says it's very difficult. There's a lot of obstacles and there's a lot of barriers that people who amass a lot of earthly treasures have to, a lot of hurdles they have to jump over in order to make it to heaven. And so, Peter, kind of being Peter a little bit and being one of those who kind of, has a little bit of a questioning mind, speaks up to Jesus and says, see, we've left everything and followed you. What then will we have? So at that point, you kind of get the feeling that because Peter and the other disciples have given up so much, and because of their status as Jesus' disciples, he kind of feels, or he kind of thinks that there's a potential for them to have a little bit greater position once they make it to heaven. And Jesus kind of crushes that right quick, and he tells them, and this is a little bit lengthy, but Jesus' response to Peter and the other disciples, still in chapter 19, verses 28 through 30, Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. And that last sentence, that last verse is going to be something that we can tie in directly to the end of my parable, the laborers in the vineyard, that we're going to spend most of our time about. This is Jesus' attempt, or this is his position right here, to where he's kind of letting the disciples know, hey, listen, yes, you are the disciples, and yes, you've been given, the secrets up to this point. You've been given, certain powers and things like that. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that in heaven your reward is going to be any greater. And so now that's kind of left us to where the parable takes place. And this is Jesus' parable, kind of two different scenarios. Jesus uses this parable, one, to teach the disciples a lesson. But two, it's also a lesson that we can apply to our lives as Christians, even in 2020 and moving forward in the future. So we'll kind of tie it all together here. I hope I do. That's my goal. So let's read the parable, and y'all bear with me because this one is kind of a lengthy parable, 16 verses. I tried to put it up here, hopefully big enough so that you all can read along with me. So starting in chapter 20, Matthew chapter 20, verse 1, it says, for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into the vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. Verse 5, so they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th, he did the same. And about the 11th hour, he went and found others standing. And he said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? They said to him, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, these last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day in the scorching heat. But he replied to one of them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first and the first last. So that brings us, through the summary of the reading of the parable at least. I'll try to break these down a little bit and discuss kind of the verses And they may be a little bit scattered. I won't necessarily go 1, 2, 3. I'll kind of jumble around a little bit, and I do have a purpose for that. Hopefully it comes out like I want it to. But the first thing we try to do is we want to, the teacher in me, we want to identify key terms. All right, we got to know who we're talking about here and what we're talking about and the importance of it. So in verse 1, going back to chapter 20, verse 1, it says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard." So first off, who is the master? All right, the master is God. Okay, who are the laborers? In this, we can relate this, to us as Christians. We Christians, we are the laborers. Okay, hired by God. Now, the last thing that we need to identify is, what is the vineyard? Well, the vineyard is really anywhere. It's anywhere where Christians can do our work that we are commanded to do. Okay, and the work is going to be different. Everybody's work is different. And that's something that we'll talk about works here in a little bit. But just as He hired laborers for His vineyard to do work for Him, and they receive a reward for it, we as Christians, we are hired by God to do work for God, and we will receive a reward for our works as well. So now we've identified the terms. Okay, the question then becomes, why does God need laborers? Okay, what's the purpose of, why do we need workers? Why do we have to work? Why do we have to labor? Colossians chapter 3, verses 23 and 24 tells us, "Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ." So this tells us that we should do work for whose sake? For our sake? For people's sake? For your friend's sake? No. We should do the work for the Lord's sake. We should do the work because it's what we are commanded to do, and it's because it's what makes the Lord happy. Okay, He enjoys seeing us do His work out there in the public, and to try to do things for Him inside the church, outside of the church. It makes Him happy, and that's who we should do it for. We shouldn't do it so that people can look at us and say, "Oh well, he's a good person. He's doing the right thing," and so we can try to achieve some type of status on earth. That's not what we're doing it for. We're doing it for the Lord. Now, I'm skipping a little bit here on to verse 8, where he talks about beginning with the last. Okay, beginning with the last and the last first is kind of how he does that. So in verse 8, he says, "And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first.'" Now, this is where you can kind of tie it into what our background about in chapter 19 was, where he tells that Peter and the other disciples, many who are first will be last. That was Matthew chapter 19, verse 30. You believe that he intentionally includes this actually multiple times in our parable. In the parable that we're studying, chapter 20, the laborers in the vineyard, he says it not only in chapter 8, but he says it to kind of sum up the parable at the end in verse 16. So this is a key phrase that he is making sure that these disciples are understanding. Okay, just because you're first on earth doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be first in heaven. There really is no position greater than the other in heaven. Okay, because the reward's going to be the same. So that's just a re-emphasizing of the ending of chapter 19. Okay, now what is the reward? That's what we have to try to kind of identify and make sure we know what's going on here. In chapter 9 or in chapter 20, verse 9 of our parable, it says, "And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius." Okay, that's what the master felt was right. He says that earlier on in the parable. I'll pay you what's right. Okay, meaning I'll do right by you. And this is also the same exact payment that was promised to the first workers, the initial workers that were hired initially. Okay, who we can kind of assume we're going to be the disciples. The workers that were hired first are going to be the disciples, and they were given a reward, or they were with the understanding that they had a reward. And then when these 11th hour workers get paid what they were supposed to get, immediately they start to assume, well, we agreed on a denarius, but since he paid these 11th hour workers what he agreed to pay us, surely we're going to get a raise. Surely he's going to pay us more because we done the more work. Okay? It's only fair. That's what they feel. Okay? But, something else we're going to talk about is what we see as fair isn't necessarily what God sees as fair. Okay? Because he has his own plan, and sometimes his plan doesn't necessarily match up with what our plan is. Okay? But we tie this into, and it's all coming to fruition here in just a moment, hopefully. Okay? But we assume, based on this, that you have the first hour workers and you have the 11th hour workers, all are getting paid the same amount. So the reward, we understand that the reward is going to be the same for all Christians. Okay, for all faithful Christians. So the next question is, these first hour workers, remember, go back a slide, it says beginning with the last up to the first. So the first hour workers, or the third hour workers, or the ninth hour workers, they've not been paid yet. The 11th hour workers were the first ones to be paid. So when it comes down and they pay the ninth hour workers and the sixth hour workers and the third hour workers, then these first hour workers, the ones who were initially hired, are saying, all right, what then will we have? That's their question. Okay? Matthew chapter 20 verse 10, still back in our own parable here, says, now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them received a denarius, which is exactly equal to what the 11th hour workers were paid. Okay? So they thought, they were certain, going into this thing, they were certain that they were going to get paid more than a denarius, okay, which was a day's wage. A denarius in this time, that was just kind of like the standard rate for a day's work was a denarius. So they thought, well, we're going to get paid way more than that, okay? We have to assume that. Now, this kind of ties back into Peter's question to Jesus. When he's asking him, Jesus says, it's very difficult for a rich man. How is it again? I got to go back now. See, I'm sorry here. I don't want to paraphrase. This is why we can do this. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person near the kingdom of heaven. So now, go back here. Make sure I don't pass it up. Peter said in reply, see, we have left everything and followed you. What then will we have? So they thought their reward would be greater. The disciples, just like these first hour workers, thought that their reward was going to be greater because of the work that they had done. Okay, Peter and the other disciples as well. And Peter's the one that speaks up, but the other disciples were probably thinking the same thing. Okay, Peter's just the one that speaks up oftentimes. All right. So it's based on that response, based on that question that Peter asks Jesus. He was under the assumption that the disciples would receive a greater reward because of their position. Okay? So, is that how we should feel? Is that how the disciples should have felt? Is that how the first hour workers should have felt? And now, tying it into us as Christians, us as, in 2020, there are people in our lives that are saved at different stages. Some people are saved early on in life, and they remain faithful, and they remain steadfast in their faith, okay, on up until it's time for them to go be with Jesus. And then there's others who receive salvation very late in life. Okay, this is where it ties into us as individual Christians right now in 2020 is we as Christians shouldn't feel as though because we have been faithful our entire lives, because let's say we get saved as a child early on in life, and then we remain faithful, we remain in church, and we continue to do the things that we're commanded to do, and we do these works that we're commanded to do. we shouldn't feel as though we're a better Christian as someone who, let's say, very late in life, maybe they've not lived a life that they're proud of living, and they understand that, and they have truly repented, and they've accepted Jesus into their heart. And late in life, we're still talking about these people late in life, their reward is going to be equal to those Christians who have been faithful their entire lives. So how should us Christians who, well, not us, I wasn't early on in life, but I'm sorry. How should Christians who were saved early in life, we should be happy for those people. We should accept it, and we should praise and be happy for anybody who achieves salvation and who accepts Jesus. We shouldn't say, oh, well, we didn't get to go out and party and do the things of the world and stuff like that, but we remained faithful. These other people didn't, and they sinned, and they done all these things, and then they accept Jesus late into their life, and they're going to get the same thing I do. That's not fair. That's not how our approach should be. We should rejoice and we should be glad for anyone who's saved, no matter when in their life they're saved, at what point, no matter what they've done previously. Okay? Because we can't judge a person's heart. Only God can judge that person's heart. And if they're faithful and they truly accept Jesus, we should be happy for that. We shouldn't grumble like these first hour workers did. We go through that. I kind of talked about all this before I put the slide up there. I'm sorry. So I'll just read and go on. Is this the correct response? So Matthew chapter 20, verse 11 and 12 says, and on receiving it, the denarius that they were paid, and on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, these last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day in the scorching heat. So they're obviously a little upset. They're a little mad at how the master has chosen to pay them this wage. Is this the correct response? No. Based on what we've already talked about, like I kind of jumped ahead there a little bit. We should be happy no matter what we're paid, no matter what. If we agree on a reward and we understand going into it that our reward is an eternal home in heaven, we should be happy for that, and we should not ask for anything more than that, because that's what we were promised. Just like anyone who is saved, that's what they're promised. I didn't put this on here, and after I was already done with this, and I was going through my outline in my mind, and I'm gonna paraphrase it and just mention it briefly because I don't want to misquote anything. I was thinking about nobody's doing the prodigal son, are they? Is anybody doing the prodigal son? Okay. That popped into my mind as I was doing this slide. As I was going through this on my outline, I was thinking about that, how you have the two sons. One gets his, I guess, whatever you call it, what his father owes him, I don't know what you'd call it, but he gets it and he goes off and he squanders it, right? And then you have the other son that stays home with the father, and he works and he remains loyal to the father and works all this time while the other son is out there doing, just wasting away the inheritance that was promised him. And then when the son finally runs out of money, he comes back home to daddy. And what does the dad do? The dad is just ecstatic over the fact that his son has returned. And he goes out and he does all these things. He killed the fattest calf or something. He throws this big party because the son has returned. Well, the one son who remained faithful the entire time, initially, he's a little upset. He goes to his father and he says, listen, I've been here with you this whole time. I've been working with you in the fields and plowing the fields, and I've been saving up my inheritance, and I've been doing right by you, Dad. And then brother comes back, and he's been out there doing, anything and everything, and you accept him back, and you throw him a big old party and all these things, and, to some extent, like I said, I'm going to misquote it, but the father says, he was lost, and now he's came back. Lost, but now he's found. And that may be a horrible paraphrase, and I apologize for that, but it came to me as I was already doing this. I think that ties into this scenario right here is we should rejoice, is basically how the scenario goes. So we're talking about works now. Okay, I don't have much more. We're talking about works now. So is there a particular amount of work that we can do that is sufficient or that should give us a certain status ahead of anyone else? We've talked about this multiple times in our study classes that everybody's work is different. They know not to put me on leading singing. That's not a work that I can do. Okay? But I try to do other things, and all the men we try to do everything. We try to do whatever we can for the Lord. My work is different than somebody else's work, and their work is different than somebody else's work. So it's not all going to be equal, but we're doing what we can, and that's the point. So can we do enough work to earn our way into heaven? Ephesians chapter 2 verses 8 and 9 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." Remember, we're not supposed to do works for a particular person or for people or for a position. We're supposed to do work for the Lord. And this work is going to be different. It says we're saved through faith, not by works. All right, the works is just something that we do to show our love for God and for Jesus. Okay? It's not something that we're judged by. As long as in our heart we're doing what we feel like is what we can do for God, then God is He's gonna be happy for us, and He's gonna accept that work. Okay, so we've answered that question right there. Can we do enough work to earn our way into heaven? Absolutely not. But we can do what we can do. Verses 13 through 15, back in our parable now, Matthew chapter 20. Says a deal is a deal. So the master replies to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity?" So these first hour workers, they grumble and they're upset with what they were given, and they show their frustrations to the master. And the master just tells them, "Listen, we had a deal. A deal's a deal. We agreed on a denarius, and that's what you got. Okay? Be happy for it. Accept it." This kind of goes into what we were saying earlier with, our idea of fair and our idea of what we should receive is not always necessarily, it doesn't always coincide or go along with God's plan. Okay? And so I have a supporting scripture here where it says, "Don't doubt the plan." So in Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9, this is God saying, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." There's your answer right there. Be happy with what you get, because I've got a plan. And my plan is what it is. It's the perfect plan. And you have to accept it. Just because my plan doesn't go along with your plan, it is the plan. Capital THE. It's the plan, and it's what it is. Faithful Christians should not ever doubt God's plan or question His decisions or motives. There's some things that happen that we question sometimes. Why did this happen? You hear a lot of times when things happen, people begin to doubt God and why God would let something like this happen. But we have to really evaluate God's plan. God's plan is not for things to go the way we want them to go here on earth. Okay, God's plan supersedes earthly plans. It goes above that, and He has a plan. He has a plan for us, later on that we might not know about it, and we just have to accept that and understand that it'll all come together in the end. So you have these different workers. Okay, 1st, 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 11th hours. This is, like I said, I was going to jumble and go back and forth a little bit, so this is kind of tying it into the end here. So back in our parable, chapter 20, verses 3 through 7, "And going out about the 3rd hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went. going out about the 6th hour, and the 9th he did the same. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? They said to him, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. So, what do these different workers represent? And we've already, I've already kind of went over it a little bit. I've jumped ahead of myself a little bit here, but these different workers who are hired at different times, they represent Christians who are saved at different points in their life. As we said, some are saved early on and remain faithful. Some are saved early on and go out into the world and then come back. Their reward's still the same. Others are saved later in life, middle of life. Their reward is the same. Others are saved late in life. You hear of people and people in prison who have committed horrible crimes. We don't know that person's heart. We don't know how that person, if they have truly received God, but if they have, then their reward is equal. And it's not up to us to judge them or to think that they shouldn't receive the same reward because of what they've done. So we can apply these to ourselves as being different periods of our lives in terms of conversion. So I put this in here as trying to tie it into the workers kind of theme here. When we were talking about we know when we clock in, we know when we clock out of work. We know when it's as a teacher, I know I'm getting out of work at 2:45. Okay, so every day at 2:45, I know it's time to wind down. But we don't know what time it's truly time to clock out. Okay, and I say that not really as a joke. I'm just trying to, like I say, tie it in. We don't know when it's going to be time for us to be called. So we have to be ready. We have to be ready and willing at any time, which is why if there is anyone here who has not received the Lord into their hearts, Matthew chapter 25, verses 11 through 13 says, afterward the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered, truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Okay, we don't know when it's our time. But we don't want to be caught in a position where we're not ready. Where it's time to clock out, metaphorically speaking. And we're not ready. We're not prepared. So if you're not prepared, come up here and let's make it right. Let us help you all as we stand and sing.